Well, he's got people out there.
Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Paul from the Larchmont Public Library. Tonight we have Evan Weiner to talk about the women comedy pioneers. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me. It's good to see you in person. It's been 3 years since I've been here. It's nice to see a crowd here. And hello out there in Cyberland. My name is Evan Weiner. My background is radio and TV. I've been on the Sam Donaldson show as a quote unquote pundit, MSNBC as a quote unquote pundit. I've written for op-ed pieces for New York Newsday, among others, and Mutual Radio, and also doing a lot of talks also on cruise ships. I came up with this idea just one day. I said, it's during the pandemic, I have nothing to do and I have 5 hours to kill. And I said, why don't I do something on the first ladies of comedy? And I called my friend Max Docelli. Max Docelli grew up in comedy in the Carolines, that type of venue over at in Manhattan. He also sold 5 jokes to Rodney Dangerfield and was the only white comic ever open for Red Fox. I said, you know, I'm doing this thing that I think, you know, people want to hear. And I came up with a list of people that I should speak about. He said, yeah, it's a good list, but you forgot Moms Mabley and you forgot Elaine May. But other than that, he said, it's a really, really good list. So let's take a look at the list. Sophie Tucker, the last of the Red Hot Mamas, who wasn't really a comedian, but did a lot of comedy. Moms Mabley, she was the first stand-up comic. Jean Carroll, ever hear of Jean Carroll? Well, you will. Okay, you might have seen her. Fannie Brice, who you probably have heard of. Gracie Allen of Burns and Allen. Gertrude Burke. Gertrude Burke, in my opinion, going through radio and TV all the years that I've done, the most talented person ever to come through radio, and maybe TV as well. Gertrude Burke. Whoops, we got, and we got Lucy. There is somebody else here on chat. So let's see how Molly Goldberg. Yes, Molly Goldberg. Lucy, of course. But Lucy is not really a comedian. She's an actress. She's not really a comedian, but she got her first exposure to comedy with this Three Stooges reel back in 1936. Elaine May, woman comedy pioneer. Phyllis Diller, Toady Fields. A few weeks ago, I was giving this to the seniors residents, this talk, and this woman, before I got to Toady Fields, said, if Toady Fields isn't there, I'm walking out. I'm getting in my walker and leaving. Toady Fields. Joan Rivers, there's no in between with Joan Rivers. You either love her or hate her. There is no gray area like, oh, okay. It's either one or the other. Now, it's a man's world, and I'm going to stand up here. I'm leaving the Zoom people for just a second because I'll point something out. This is TV Guide, November 2nd, 1951. Jerry Lester, Martin Lewis, Jack Benny, Jimmy Durante, Milton Berle. Lucy's show has already started. The man's world, isn't it? Now, Lucy is mentioned here. The I Love Lucy show is mentioned right down here. That's where she is. Imogene Coca is right there. So you could see on TV in the early days, it's a man's world. Now, if you go back to the smoke-filled nightclubs of the 1940s and 50s, you get that kind of vibe from the comedians like him, Jerry Lewis. Women had a very difficult time being comics, and a lot of it was because of the mindset. This is Jerry Lewis throughout the years. This is 2000. He's at the U.S. Comedy Arts Festival in Aspen, Colorado, and there's a question and answer period conducted by Martin Short. And Jerry Lewis was asked, well, do you like Lucille Ball? His response was, a woman doing comedy doesn't offend me, but it sets me back a bit. I, as a viewer, have trouble with it. I think of her as a producing machine that brings babies into the world. He was 75 years old when he said that. 13 years later, in 2013, he's 88 years old. He's at the Cannes Film Festival in France, And he's asked about women comics, and he continues, "It bothers me. I cannot sit and watch a lady diminish her qualities to the lowest common denominator. Just can't do it." Now, he's 89 years old, and he kind of has a change of heart here. In 2014, he did describe Lucille Ball as brilliant and called Carroll Burnett the greatest female entrepreneur of comedy. Sophie Tucker, last of the Red Hot Mamas. She's a singer. She's not really a comedian. There was really no place for a woman alone with a microphone on the stage. And of course, there were no microphones back in those days. Let me just get here. And there's somebody here on the chat. Martin Short is a jerk. Okay. We'll leave that at that. He was just asking questions. But anyway, Sophie Tucker, last of the Red Hot Mamas. She's a singer, not a comedian. But Lucy wasn't a comedian, and Carroll Burnett wasn't a comedian, but they work comedy into their acts. Anyway, in terms of the last of the Red Hot Mamas, Sophie Tucker, she was a singer, debuted in vaudeville in 1906, 116 years ago, and performed in blackface because producers thought she was overweight and too unattractive to sing as a white woman. Now, there were a lot of people in blackface back in those days, and there were a lot of African-American performers who performed in whiteface as part of the minstrel shows back in those days. She was successful in blackface, but she despised the form, and she wanted to vary her act. She found audiences enjoyed the suggestive content of her racier songs. She attributed her ability to amuse rather than scandalize because she was a large woman. And she did not have the traditional look of female beauty, so she could do what she wanted. She performed such songs as "Make Him Say Please," "No One Man Is Ever Going to Worry Me," and "You Got to Make It Legal, Mr. Siegel." Now, part of her appeal came from the songs that she kind of grew up with. Remember, there was really, she breaks in 1906. The Victrola wasn't around until around that time, although they had the big cylinders that had John Philip Sousa marching songs and a couple other things on it. But she grew up on traditional Jewish music, as well as African-American blues and bawdy songs. And she would go to the black clubs in New York and in Chicago, and she was influenced by double entendres, lyrics of Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey. And there is Moms Mabley. Moms Mabley, first stand-up comic, first stand-up female comic, first stand-up female comic at the Apollo. Moms Mabley started at the age of 14 in vaudeville. She had a career that spanned over 50 years. She went from vaudeville to stand-up. No radio for her. Well, you know why. She bridged the gap between the vaudevillians and modern stand-up comedy. She was the first woman comic ever to play at the Apollo Theater. And that was in 1930, and also Carnegie Hall in 1962. She was also the first openly gay comedian. She wore men's suits on her Christmas cards. Her friends called her Mr. Moms. And back in the Apollo days, she would dress like Cab Calloway. I'm going to talk about another library here because 1982, I met Cab Calloway. Now, in 1978, I was on WNEW radio as a 21-year-old because I broke a story. John Lindsay was running for Senate in 1980 in New York. And he gave me the story. So I got on WNEW, and by the time I was 24, I had interviewed Reagan and Jack Kemp, Ted Kennedy, and a whole host of people. And I covered the returning hostages in Iran. So you figure I'm quite jaded by the time I meet Cab Calloway, which is in 1982 at the library, Greenberg Library up on 119. And I'm walking in and I say, wow, it's Cab Calloway, and he's bigger than life. And I'm fumbling because I figure I'm not starstruck anymore. And I said, Mr. Calloway, what are you doing here? Same thing you are, taking books out of a library. My encounter with Cab Calloway. Anyway, Harlem mourns Moms Mabley. She ran away from home, moved to Cleveland when she was 14, taken under the wing of a vaudeville act, Butter, Beans, and Susie, who had the song, I Want Your Hot Dog in My Roll. What does that mean? Anybody know what that means? Nobody wants to tell me. I want your hot dog in my roll. She performed, what? Go to Nathan's, okay, on Central Avenue. Anyway, she started performing on the Chitlin circuit. Max opened up for Red Fox, and Red Fox and Moms probably did the same thing. Max was telling, first time he's working with Red Fox at a club. He's the opening act, and Red Fox walks into the office where the promoter is, and the guy just dumps a whole bunch of cash on the table. And Red starts counting it to make sure it's all there before he went on. She faced that on the Chitlin circuit because sometimes they just empty their pockets, say no money for you. If they gave you a check might bounce. That was what the Chitlin circuit was all about, but it provided venues for Black performers. By 1930, she was at the Apollo Theater, and she was doing 5 shows a day, along with such comedy greats as Pigmeat Markham. You ever hear of Pigmeat Markham? Anybody here watched Rowan and Martin's Laughing? Yes. Yeah, remember the skit, Here Comes the Judge? The judge was Pigmeat Markham. And in 1933, she appeared with Paul Robeson in the movie Emperor Jones. And there is Mom's Mabley, a young version of Mom's Mabley. She modeled her stage character after her great-grandmother, a former slave. The style, clever, wise, filled with raunchy humor. Eventually, she would wear frumpy, mismatched dresses and would take her teeth out. That must have been the thing because I've worked on cruise ships. I've spoken on cruise ships. I met a lot of entertainers, including a guy by the name of Jerry Ring, who's Liberace's last protege. And he was telling me the story about Martha Ray. Remember Martha Ray, the singer? And he says he's playing the piano and he rehearsed with her a little bit, but he said Martha Ray got up there, started singing, and then all of a sudden pops her teeth out. She's got a glass filled with gin. She throws the teeth into the gin, sings another song or two, says, I'm kind of thirsty, puts the teeth back in and said, oh, that gin tastes so great. And so she took her teeth out too. So it must have been a thing with old comics that would take their teeth out. During the 1940s, the height of her career, she was getting $10,000 a week for her comedy. Her early style was storytelling, and how she liked young men over old men. And her signature line was, ain't nothing an old man could do for me but bring me a message from a young man. She had an old lady persona, and because she adopted this old lady persona, she was able to talk about edgy topics such as sex, race, politics. And she had a gravel voice by this point, and she could make lines funny. She finally hits TV in 1967 on the ABC show Stage 67. And she's also in she's in something called A Look at Negro Humor in America, Time for Laughter, which is kind of a comedy, kind of a documentary, which starred Godfrey Cambridge. Remember him? Heavyset comedian, Godfrey Cambridge. She went on, she was on Smothers Brothers show. She was on Sullivan. She was on Merv Griffin, Mike Douglas. She made the rounds back in those days. She influenced Richard Pryor, Red Fox, Whoopi Goldberg, and Eddie Murphy. In fact, Murphy, in the reboot 1996 Nutty Professor film, which he got permission from Jerry Lewis to do, he played all the characters, and the grandma character was based on Mom Mabley. Jean Carroll. How many of you have heard of Jean Carroll? Nobody. First mainstream solo stand-up female comic. And a good-looking woman to boot. Think of the comics that came after her: Phyllis Diller, Joan Rivers, Toady Fields, Roseanne Barr. Can't say any of them were good-looking, right? Good-looking woman, and her looks caused some problems. She was one of the first women to make it as a solo stand-up comedian. She was born Celine Zegman in 1911. And she began her career in vaudeville. There was a progression for some comics. It was vaudeville, burlesque, radio, and then stand-up. She performed as a duo with her husband, Buddy Howe, but it was as a solo performer in the 1940s she came into her own. She talked in her routines. Remember Alan King, the comedian? She was the female Alan King, but she was problematic. A woman on stage with a microphone and a glass of water in a smoke-filled room, commanding respect. That didn't happen in the world of comedy. You heard what Jerry Lewis said, right? And she's of the time of Jerry Lewis. By the 1940s, she's on her own. Her husband becomes her manager. She makes her first TV appearance on Ed Sullivan's Toast to the Town in 1948. And she would appear on Sullivan's show more than 20 times throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and ultimately served as a prototype for such comics as Joan Rivers. And, well, Lily Tomlin isn't really a stand-up comic, but Lily Tomlin was inspired by her. She had her own TV show in 1953, and the TV show was called Take It From Me or The Jean Carroll Show. So she was very, very popular in her day in the 40s and in the 1950s. The show only lasted 11 weeks. Part of the problem, she's on ABC TV, which is owned by Paramount, and they only have 14 TV affiliates. Paramount ABC was saved when they invested into an amusement park in Anaheim called Walt Disneyland. And they asked for two shows, Disneyland and the Mickey Mouse Club, and the Mickey Mouse Club put ABC over the top. But in 1953, it was in 55 that Disneyland opened. 1953, ABC was either the third or fourth network, depending on how you viewed the Dumont network. The Jean Carroll Show, Take It From Me, aired on the week ABC TV network in 1953. It tried to mix her stand-up routine with a domestic comedy sitcom, where she was a beleaguered housewife. The Jerry Seinfeld Show, stand-up comic and a domestic situation. So it was done way before Seinfeld did it. She had, the critics liked her, but the writing on the show was panned. They never got a sponsor. Again, a weak network, and Paramount decided to get rid of it after January 54, 11 episodes, and none have survived. Take a look at her. She's a good-looking woman, isn't she? She is currently at the Paramount in New York. She's been on TV shows. This has to be the late 40s, early 50s. Chesterfield Supper Club with Perry Como. The Toast of the Town with Ed Sullivan. Texaco Star Theater, Milton Berle. And I take it's around 1951 because the Cavalcade of Stars she's on. And that's the Jackie Gleason show in 1951 on the Dumont TV network, where he introduced the Honeymooners. And Audrey Meadows was not the original Alice Cramden. It was Pert Kelton. And she was kicked off the show because she was accused of being a communist. Jean Carroll wrote nearly all of her own material. She found humor in the stuff of everyday experience: clothing, shopping, social life, family. In her day, the world of the stand-up comedy was thought to be no fit place for a woman. And you heard what Jerry Lewis thought. There were female entertainers before her, but few specialized in the solo act. She was attractive. She appeared alone on stage in a shimmering evening dress, dripping diamonds, and a mink. Her monologues, you go up to the Borscht Belt and guys were getting laughs with their version of her monologue or her version of their monologue. Driven crazy by a spouse, her kids. Yeah, male comics did the same thing, right? Still do it to this day, right? Fred Klett? Fred Klett's a guy I know from the comedies, from the cruise ships, who does the beleaguered husband thing in a mall. But then confuse the audience. Now, if you saw her talking about those situations, would you be confused? No, but in the 1940s and 50s, audience were confused. Why? Attractive woman up there telling jokes. She was a radical in her day. lone woman with a microphone and an audience at her command. For a female comic to wield that sort of power was unheard of, especially in the smoke-filled universe of nightclubs. But she would set the stage for others. The others who came after her, Phyllis Diller and Joan Rivers. Now, the vaudeville burlesque radio stars sometimes became stand-up comics. Burlesque, by the way, there were two versions of burlesque. If there's a QUE at the end, it means the family could come. If there's a K at the end, it's where the women take off their clothes. Fannie Brice was a burlesque performer with a QUE at the end. She built her career on the Yiddish accent, a flair for zany parody. She appeared in burlesque and vaudeville, drama and film, and musical reviews, including 9 Ziegfeld Follies between 1910 and 1936. But it would be one sketch that she would make her mark with, Baby Snooks. And she delighted audiences with her thoroughly believable impersonation, complete with hair ribbon, starch pinafore, ankle socks, and Mary Janes. Snooks would make her famous. So famous that in 1964, there was a play on Broadway called Funny Girl. How many saw Funny Girl? Who is the star? Barbara. And who was the stand-in? Lainey Kazan. Lainey, I had a crush on Lainey Kazan when I was 13 years old. And then I started working, and I met George Vesey, who was a columnist with the New York Times, who went to Hofstra with Lainey Kazan. He said, keep it as a fantasy in your mind. You don't really want to know the real person. I said, okay. So she's still a fantasy in my mind. Anyway, a revival of Funny Girl based on Fannie's life is on Broadway right now. Burns and Allen. Somebody said that Dean Martin was great in comedy, right? Because he was the greatest straight man of all time. Maybe second to Elmer Fudd, or maybe better than Elmer Fudd, who's the greatest cartoon straight man of all time. The act that started featured Gracie as the straight woman and George as the silly man. That's the way Nathan Birnbaum, George Burns, had planned it out. He was the writer. He was going to be the stupid one. She was going to be the smart aleck. But something happened on the way to star them. The team noticed that when Gracie, as the straight man, was getting a lot of laughs, it prompted George to say, hey, wait a minute. Why don't you be the silly woman and I'll be the straight man? And it worked. Gracie was silly, right? She said all kind of silly things. On their radio show, George would end the show with the line, say goodnight, Gracie. And Gracie would say goodnight, Gracie. Fast forward to 1968, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In TV show, 68 through about 73. And Dan Rowan would end the show with the line, say goodnight, Dick. And there'd be a whole bunch of people saying, say goodnight, Dick. And the last person saying, say goodnight, Dick, was Dick Martin. Obviously, an ode to George Burns and Gracie Allen. Most talented woman ever in radio. Maybe the most talented woman and man ever, mixing men and women together. Part of the 20,000 scripts that she wrote. Bob Hope couldn't ad-lib out of a paper bag without his writers. Just couldn't do it. A lot of comics need their writers. She didn't. She could write, she could produce, she could edit, she could do a whole bunch of things. In my opinion, the most talented person ever to come down the pike in radio. You might agree or disagree, but I'm looking at the crowd in here. You all missed the Goldberg show on radio, although you can hear it on apps. But here's why. You're the jury, and I'm gonna make my case to the jury right now. Gertrude Burke was born Tilly Elderstein, Lower Manhattan, Lower East Side of New York City in 1898. Her father, Jake, ran a resort in the Catskill Mountains in 1912. Can you imagine what that looked like? Actually, the floorboards at Cutcher's probably were there since 1912. Last time I spoke at Cutcher's was 2006. I nearly went through the floorboard in the main lobby, and Mrs. Cutcher said, "Oh, we got to get that fixed." Anyway, she's 14 years old, and she begins to create and perform skits to amuse the guests of children, or the guests' children. Of course, this is the Catskills, so she's up there and she's going to meet a guy, right? You know, singles dances and all that. And she does. She meets an older Englishman by the name of Lewisburg one summer at the resort. I don't know if they did Dirty Dancing. I wasn't there. Have you seen the movie Dirty Dancing? Anyway, so he wooed her, and she was 18 in 1916 when she got married, which probably was old for a woman back then. So this should be it. She should be leaving her father and moving to New Orleans because Lewis has a career as an engineer on the sugar plantation, but a fire burnt it down, and they decide we're coming back to New York, and she decides she's going to pursue her writing and acting career full time. And she changes her first name to Gertrude. She's married, so it's Gertrude Burke. She begins writing radio scripts about a fictional family. Although I'm not sure how fictional it was, because she got a lot of the stories from her old friends on the Lower East Side. It's about a family, the Goldbergs, Jewish immigrants who are trying to assimilate into America. The Goldbergs, combination of her mother's maiden name and her husband's last name. It premieres on NBC in 1929, just 3 years after Sarnoff founded NBC, David Sarnoff. And she's there as a placeholder in the role of Molly because she wants to find another actress who she thinks is better. But she never does. And she was so good that when she was sick for a week, she got massive amounts of fan mail asking, "Where's Molly?" Molly had made it. And there she is. Molly is there. There's Molly in front of the NBC microphones. 1936, she signed a 5-year, $1 million contract with the sponsor, Procter & Gamble. Today, it would be about $21 million over the 5 years. By the end of the decade, she's making $7,500 a week to produce, write, and star in her own radio series. During the height of her program, she's the second most respected woman in America, according to polling, after Eleanor Roosevelt. That is my friend, Aviva Klempner. In fact, she was, last time I saw her was prior to the pandemic over at the Westchester JCC, where I'm speaking in November. Anyway, she does DVDs. She was the producer and director of The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg, which was on PBS. She also recently did Moberg, the Jewish catcher who was a spy. And she also did, and she told me this one was her favorite one, Yoo-hoo, Mrs. Goldberg. So they may, for all you know, Paul may have it upstairs. She wrote and performed the original sketch for Channel 1, WNBT TV in New York in 1940. And she thought about doing a live stage version of the Goldbergs as a mean, and went on TV just to see how it looked, except there was no video in those days, so she had to look while other people were performing on the one and only TV show on Channel 1. A number of years later, she had a play on Broadway. 1948, Me and Molly made its Broadway debut. She quit the radio show in 1946, but the play convinced her it was time to go to TV. TV, the network TV, which started with Dumont in 1946, followed by CBS and NBC. So she goes on Broadway and takes a close look at it and says, I think visually this will be okay on TV. It was only 156 performances, which meant it lasted about 20 weeks. But she was satisfied with it. And she pitches the show to CBS in January 1949. It comes on TV. It's still on in some place somewhere on one of those old MeTV channels done in kinescope. And people liked it, critical acclaim, and it got viewered. Goldberg's on TV, but as Sir Isaac Newton once pointed out when the apple hit him on top of the head, what goes up must come down. And this guy, Philip Loeb, sitting, looking up at Gertrude Burke, is the reason that the show implodes suddenly. But before we get into that, let's talk about Gertrude Burke. She's the lead writer. She was the star. She was the producer of the Goldbergs, and the Goldbergs climbed in popularity. 1950, she wins the first Best Actress Emmy Award. And the Goldbergs nominated for the Best Kinescope Show. Best way I could describe Kinescope is you got a camera, right? And it's shooting that because there was no such thing as videotape in those days. And then you recorded it and you sent it out to stations that weren't part of a loop, which was all the 4 stations west of the Mississippi. It would be in 1950 that 35 millimeter film came into being with the Groucho, You Bet Your Life show. Oprah, Oprah has all this stuff going. Oprah never wrote shows, and she might have been the producer of the show, but she never did what Gertrude Burke did. She published a cookbook. She wrote an advice column called Mama Talks. She had a clothing line for women. Her television show was made into a movie by Paramount Pictures called Molly, and she was on the set. Not only was she on the set as an actress, she was in the editing room at night, looking at the film and putting it together. Oh yeah, she was also the screenwriter and the producer. I rest my case. Was she the most talented person ever in radio? I'm asking the jury, yes or no. So anyway, but like I said, what goes up, like Sir Isaac Newton did, what goes up must come down. The House on Un-American Activities. It's McCarthy, Joe McCarthy's time. McCarthy starts in 1950, Wheeling, West Virginia, gives a speech on February 8th, 1950, that there were all kind of communists in the State Department. But of course, he never produced any card-carrying communists. But it was enough to really get the country into, or some people in the country into Red Scare. House on Un-American Activities Committee, which had been around for a while, publishes Red Channels. The report of communist influence in radio and television. The co-star, Philip Loeb, an active union organizer among actors, is listed in this pamphlet. A report of communist influence in radio and television. Sponsors all of a sudden are having a little problem with this most popular show in Gertrude Burke. And she's faced with a great dilemma because the sponsor, General Foods, is Jello Sanka, is having some problems because of Philip Loeb. And they tell her, you want us to continue sponsoring you? You fire Loeb. She doesn't want to fire Loeb. That's her friend. They have great stage chemistry. So she appeals to the sponsors. She appeals to CBS. And she even appeals to the New York's Cardinal Francis Spellman, who said, yeah, I could probably help you, but you got to do one thing, convert to Catholicism. Well, that was the end of that. CBS had employees taking loyalty oaths to the U.S. in 1950. And I talk about that in my Lucy talk, about how Lucy was not an employee of CBS. Berg resisted network demands to fire Loeb. CBS and the sponsor, General Foods, just keep General Foods in mind because it's going to come back in a couple of minutes, canceled the Goldbergs in 1951. Well, she wants to get the show back on. And she decides, I got to replace Philip Loeb. And she gets Harold Stone for the one season on NBC in 1953, and then Robert Harris for the one season on Dumont. But sponsors aren't coming back. Viewers aren't coming back. The NBC show is canceled. Dumont picked up the show. They couldn't really afford it. It was gone. The Goldbergs' time had passed. McCarthyism and blacklisting won. Oh, about Gertrude Burke, she was also blacklisted as a communist supporter through her association with Philip Loeb. And there is Philip Loeb. Philip Loeb, anybody ever see the movie The Front with Woody Allen and Zero Mostel? Well, basically, Zero Mostel's character was based on Philip Loeb. It's about blacklisting and people writing under assumed names and all that other stuff. And the Zero Mostel character dies in the movie. Philip Loeb in 1955 was unable to find any work, although Gertrude Burke was sending him money to support his schizophrenic son, and he would ultimately commit suicide. She was left to deal with her ruined career. He checked himself into the Taft Hotel in Midtown Manhattan under a false name and took a fatal dose of sleeping pills. Lucille Ball, comedian or an actress or performer? Got that question for you. She really wasn't a comedian. She never did stand-up comedy. She never did stand-up comedy. 1950, CBS approached Lucy about doing a weekly TV program. She was a failure till she was 37 years old. 1948, she lucked into a radio show called My Favorite Husband. It was a pilot show that aired on July 5th, 1948, and wasn't supposed to be on the air, but our Miss Brooks wasn't ready, and CBS said, just let's throw it on. We'll fill up the half hour. If it bombs, nobody will ever know. But it became a hit. And so they decided, let's get her on TV. She's 39 years old. She has 2 years of radio success. Yeah, she was in a lot of movies. She was in radio before, but she was a performer. That was all she was. So she jumps at the chance, except Lucy, and I give a whole talk on Lucy. Lucy was a businesswoman, although she didn't want you to know she was a businesswoman. And she gives CBS a bunch of demands, and her first requirement for a show becomes a major sticking point. She wants her real life husband, Desi Arnaz, and they were legally married, and that's an important thing here to remember. They were legally married. A Cuban, actually Cuban exile. He and his family were tossed out of Cuba in 1933 during the Sergeant's Revolt. Desi's father was politically connected. They were very connected business-wise, including the rum company that fled to Puerto Rico. But they were on the wrong side of the Sergeant's Revolt. So she wants Desi to play her TV husband because she wants to save her marriage. CBS executives balked at the prospect, and CBS and General Foods, Jell-O, the potential sponsor, thought the American public would never accept Desi as the husband of a red-blooded American girl from Jamestown, New York. CBS says, give us Richard Benning. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. He was the radio co-star. He'd be fine. Jell-O decided that Desi was too much of a problem. So they dropped out. And they would, of course, drop out of the Goldberg show. But Lucy wanted to save her marriage, hence working together. And yes, they were legally married in 1940 and had been married for 10 years at this point. Lucy said, yeah, both of us, or you don't get either one of us. And eventually CBS conceded, even though the network had its doubts about Desi, who was Cuban, had a strong Cuban accent, made his words came out funny as well. And Cuban English, like Lucy explained, oh, the other thing, Desi and Lucy were an interracial or multi-ethnic couple. Did you know that? They were an interracial couple, but they were married. They were married. Let's see why CBS, or let's examine why both CBS and General Foods had a big problem with this. Rutherford B. Hayes was president of the United States, 1877, 1881. You have to go back 73 years to understand why CBS had a problem with Desi, why General Foods had a problem with Desi. Because interracial marriage was illegal in parts of the United States in 1950, 17 states to be exact. American civil rights movement was stalled since 1875. Desegregation was in the South, or desegregation in the South was ended with the Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel J. Tilden presidential race in 1876. To this day, nobody knows who really won that election. Hayes became president after the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, cut a deal with the Republicans. The Democrats said, take the federal troops out of Louisiana, take them out of South Carolina, take them out, give us states' rights. And if you do that, we'll give you the Oval Office. And that's what Rutherford B. Hayes did. And that ended the civil rights movement and Reconstruction in the South. Oh, interracial marriage at that point, illegal in more than a dozen states. So they decide they're going to go out on tour in 1950, summer of 1950, and they're going to prove to audiences that, yeah, we're legally married, except in the 17 states that didn't recognize interracial marriage. And we're legally married, and yes, we are funny together. That's Desi doing the Cuban Pete routine with, what was that? I forgot, her name was Sally from Delancey Street in that skit. During the summer of 1950, they go on tour and they prove that they're believable as husband and wife. And CBS says, all right. Okay, yeah, we'll take you. And then they made another demand. They said, we'll put up the money for the show. We don't want to be employees. We'll put up the money for the show, which was a brilliant business move because they own the show. And the business of I go through my whole Lucy talks about the business of I Love Lucy, which changed TV. And they were TV's first millionaires because of their business move. So it's a smash hit. By the way, for those of you who watched the I Love Lucy show, how many of you watch I Love Lucy? Let me ask you a question. What's the most important relationship on the show?
Lucy and Ethel.
Lucy and Ethel. Lucy and Ethel. And they did that again on the next show. Hello? It's your mother. You remember your mother? Elaine May, who's still alive. Elaine May. She was part of a team. Elaine May was a comedian, writer, director, performer, founding member of the Chicago improv comedy theater group, Second City. They achieved recognition in the early 1960s for dry, witty technique in the comedy duo of Nichols and May, and went on to write, direct, and perform on Broadway and in motion pictures. I'm going to veer off the road for a second on the exit ramp. I do a talk on 1977, and that was the year that Annie broke. And I used to know Tom Meehan, and that's the friendship that got away in 1980. I was a kid, and Tom had just done Annie and was doing a remake of I Remember Mama, and we went our separate ways. Tom told me that it was Mike Nichols who saved Annie from oblivion in 1974, put up the money for Annie, and pushed the show to eventually it got on Broadway. But that's part of my 1977 talk. In 1950, Elaine May attended the University of Chicago, and she meets Mike Nichols. 1955, she joins the Compass Theater, where she and Nichols and a number of other notable comedians perform improv comedy. The group included Shelley Berman, who you might remember for his telephone routine, Ellen Arkin, and Barbara Harris, and they formed the Second City improv group. It was while in Second City that Elaine May and Mike Nichols decided to break off, form a comedy duo, and take the act to the road, and there they are, and the act ended up on Broadway in 1960 and 61. They do 306 performances. They release a number of comedy records, including An Evening with Mike Nichols and Elaine May in 1960, and won a 1961 Grammy Award for Best Comedy Performance. I remember Elaine May as an 8-year-old, and that's my fondest memory because I used to sit around watch That Was the Week That Was with David Frost and Nancy Ames, the TW3 girl. I still remember I can still sing the theme song. Anyway, it was a satirical news program that she helped write. It was the first of its kind, news as comedy. In 1972, she directed Heartbreak Kid, based on Neil Simon's script. She continued to work on film, worked with Warren Beatty on the script of an updated Here Comes Mr. Jordan from 1941 called Heaven Can Wait, and also the Joe Klein novel about the 1992 presidential election, Primary Colors, mostly about the primaries, for the screen in 1998. Phyllis Diller. Remember what Jean Carroll looked like? She looked nothing like Jean Carroll. The hair, the cigarette, the gloves, the loud costumes, the laugh, and all that. Phyllis Diller is probably the most unlikely successful stand-up comic in history. Zany comedian, self-depreciation, flat out self-mockery. Born in Lima, Ohio, and she went to the Sherwood Conservatory in Chicago before moving to Bluffton College in Ohio with the intention of becoming a music teacher. She would meet Sherwood Diller. They'd marry in 1939. They'd work together, support the family, no vaudeville or radio for Phyllis Diller. In fact, she was writing columns for a newspaper, San Leandro, California, sort of like me. So that makes her the most unlikely of all the comedians. But she gets a break. She's on the show with Groucho Marx. Anyway, it's the mid-1950s. She's working as a journalist, and she's a contestant on You Bet Your Life. And she leaves an impression, so much so that the Purple Onion Comedy Club in San Francisco said, come on down. And she kills. She kills. And then she goes to New York's Blue Angel. She kills. And then an appearance on the Jack Paar Show. She's not too much different than Jean Carroll, typical housewife, talked about the suburbs, kids, pets, neighbors, mothers-in-law. But her most notable and notorious routines were filled with anecdotes about her husband, Fang, and her numerous facelifts after she got in trouble with Fang. She had animated facial expressions, the costumes, the overdone makeup, the loud cackling laugh. She would have her cigarette and laugh at her own jokes with that cackle. She ended up on this guy's show, Jack Paar, when he was there, when he wasn't walking out. So she was capturing the eye of important people. And she said, I got my national exposure on the Jack Paar Show. Not really. She got her national exposure with Groucho. My first big turning point, not really. Her turning point was with Groucho. And several movies with Bob Hope really boosted my career. But Fang would get her in trouble. She divorced Diller. Sherwood Diller in 1965, married Ward Donovan that year, but got a divorce. But the Diller family was not happy with Phyllis. And it's because of the Fang character. And they sued her for defamation. She settled out of court. She wasn't libeling them, but she gave them money and that was it. Some of the jokes included the fictitious husband Fang, whose idea of a 7-course dinner was a 6-pack and a bologna sandwich. Last time I said, let's eat out, we ate in the garage. Goldie Fields. Goldie Fields was a child prodigy singing on radio in Hartford, goes to school in Boston, and by the time she's 20 years old, she's doing stand-up comedy. And she meets a guy by the name of George Johnston, who's also doing stand-up comedy, and they decide to move to New York together. Now, in the 1960s, there were 2 television personalities that could make or break your career. You want to guess them? One of them, Sullivan. Well, we'll get to the other one in a minute. Sullivan walks into the Copacabana and he sees Goldie Fields and says, come on, I got a really big shoe here tonight. Jerry Stiller told me all about, well, I'm not going to get off that beaten path, but Jerry Stiller told me about the 36 appearances he and Ann made and Sullivan and all that. Anyway, so Ed Sullivan gives her the break she needs. She used her size and weight as spoken material in comedy acts of being an overweight Jewish woman, and she was a garlishly dressed, low-class housewife. She was also a tumor. Anybody know what a tumor is? Up in the Catskills? Well, I can't.
Mixed with the guests.
Yeah, mixed with. Well, I'll give you an example. Mel Brooks was a tumor. Jerry Lewis was a tumor. I know the last of the tumors. Crazy Tyrone. So here's Morty and Sylvia. They're walking like this to their next activity. And here comes crazy. And they jump 10 feet. Gotcha. And he's on to that was what the tumor did. For the most part. Well, at least Mel Brooks did as a tumor. Anyway, she worked as a tumor who entertained the guests between acts at New York clubs, and she was the first female tumor. Joe Malinsky, you either hated her or you loved her. I have not met many people who know of her abilities who are in between saying, well, I could take her or leave her, or she's okay. You either loved her or hated her. In the mid-1960s, she was pushing the boundaries of taste and drawing grudging respect from her fellow stand-up comics in the largely male-dominated field. Nightclub managers were quick to fire her after dicey performances, and she wasn't getting paid much money, maybe $5 a night, like Max told me how he started. If you're a male comic and you had a bad set, the guy put his arm around you. Better, we'll come back tomorrow. You'll be better tomorrow. Keep working on it. Keep working on it. But Joan Rivers and other female comics, there was no tomorrow. If your performance wasn't good, you were out the door. Audiences sometimes found her grating, and Joe Malinsky's parents regarded their daughter as a failure. Childless, divorced, unable to find steady work in a respectable profession. Ask Max if it's a respectable profession, and he will tell you no. Comedy is not respectable. He didn't like the usual Catskill shtick. He played the Borscht Belt, but was looking for something else, and she would find inspiration in Lenny Bruce, the comic, a social critic, satirist, screenwriter, renowned for his open, freestyling, critical form of comedy, which integrated satire, politics, religion, sex, and vulgarity. His 1964 conviction in an obscenity trial, he was in Greenwich Village, performing The Late Show. If you're going to Greenwich Village in The Late Show and you see a comic there, chances are you're not going to hear a sermon from Cardinal Spellman, right? Except it was Cardinal Spellman who set him up with the DA, Frank Hogan, because they were worried about his influence on the morals of people. Hey, if you're in a comedy club at 12:30 at night, you're not worrying about morality, but that's another story for another day. But he was convicted, sentenced to 4 years of house arrest and on probation. And George Pataki gave him a pardon in 2003, 37 years after Lenny Bruce died of drug overdose. But he paved the way for outspoken countercultural era comics, the trial for obscenity, seen as a landmark for freedom of speech in the US. And this is what attracted Joan Rivers, his straight core Frank style. And she changed from the memorized scripted acts, which comics do, except for George Carlin, because he could come up with like 7 or 8 different scripts a year. Canned scripted performance to open discussion of her private life, ranging from an abusive childhood to making fun of her looks and lack of domestic abilities. By the way, anybody watch Mrs. Maisel? Who do you think the character is modeled after? Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers. Here's Johnny. There were 2 people in the 1960s who could make or break your career. One of them was Sullivan. The other one was this guy. And this is from February 17th, 1965. She made her first appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Rivers credited this episode to be her breakthrough, as Carson said to her on the air, "You're going to be a star." Following this appearance, she became a frequent guest on the program and a close friend of Carson. Now, I'm going to name some people who remained friendly with Carson. Dick Cavett, who used to be his writer. He would be opposite him on ABC. And Carson used to watch Cavett's show and call him up and make suggestions to Dick Cavett saying, Richard, you should do this. Richard, that was good, and that's good, and that's good. Joey Bishop. Carson and Joey Bishop were the comic for the Rat Pack. If Joey wasn't there, Johnny was there. If Johnny wasn't there, Joey was there. Joey was opposite Carson on ABC. Joey was on Carson's 10th anniversary show in 1972. And there was Merv Griffin. Merv Griffin's right-hand man was Dick Carson, Johnny's brother. So he was still friendly with all these people, even though they were opposition. She was in the circuit with Lenny Bruce and Woody Allen and Richard Pryor and George Carlin and Dick Cavett. But even though they were peers and friends, she felt she was never included because of the sexist practice within the comedy industry. And so she'd hit the circuit, which was Sullivan and Mike Douglas and Merv Griffin and Dick Cavett and Girl Talk with Virginia Graham, and wrote some material for the Puppet Topio Gigio. Did you know she was handicapped? You know she had a handicap? Neither did I until I read the New York Times. New York Times Review, 1965. Joan Rivers, a new comedian of ripening promise who opened at midweek for a 2-week run at the bitter end, is an unusually bright girl who's overcoming the handicap of a woman comic. Looks pretty and blonde and bright, yet manages to make people laugh. Wait a minute, does somebody want to explain to me, okay, she's a bright girl. Bright girls can't make people laugh? She's a woman. Woman can't make people laugh? Looks pretty? Pretty can't make people blonde? Can't? That was a New York Times review of her. I'm not sure that was what I would call a high class, hey, I got to put this on my resume review. I don't know about what you think, but I find a lot of things wrong with that review. And they're trying to be nice to her. But she had the handicap, women comic. The Tonight Show, 1983, she becomes the permanent guest host of The Tonight Show. And Carson named her the first permanent guest host. She jokingly referred to her Tonight Show life as having been Johnny Carson's daughter, of reference to his long-term mentoring of her. But there is the feud, and it comes to an end. Here she is on the show, and here he's got the picture from when she was on the show back in February 1965. Johnny Carson never spoke to his former Tonight Show protege again when she left to host her own Fox TV late night program, which started on October 9th, 1986, called The Late Night Show. Johnny was the one person who said, yes, she has talent. Yes, she's funny. This was an op-ed piece she wrote in 1986. He was the first person in power who respected what I was doing and realized what I could become. He handed me my career. In the same op-ed, she explained she took the offer in part because she was unsettled. Carson's contract was only renewed for 2 years through 1987, hers through 1986. NBC thought that Carson might retire in 87, had a list of 11 people who could take Carson's place. Joan Rivers wasn't one of them. First person I talked to was Johnny, and he hung up on me, never ever spoke to me again. Then he denied I called him. This was in the Hollywood Reporter in 2012. Couldn't figure it out. I'd see him in the restaurant, go over and say hello. He wouldn't talk to me. And she's blacklisted from The Tonight Show. After her show, The Late Show, ends in 1987. Not welcome back to The Tonight Show. Jay Leno upheld the ban out of respect for Johnny. Conan O'Brien also banned her from the show. She comes back to the show, Jimmy Fallon's first episode in March 2014. Carson can make or break a career. That's Wayne Cotter. Wayne Cotter was a guy who went to the University of Pennsylvania in the 1970s. Brilliant guy. He was a geek in the 1970s, gave it all up for comedy. This is 1979 or all. Within 9 years, he's on the Night Show. So he's a stand-up comic from Riverdale in the Bronx, and he's one of the last comedians to debut with Johnny Carson. And Johnny called him to the couch. He made it. In fact, he told me a number of times he didn't even have to do a sketch or set rather. He just would come to the couch. And he went on to appear on a number of shows, including Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher, and became the host of his own show on Fox Comedy Strip Live. And additionally, he owns a comedy club in Philadelphia. He lives in Wilmington, Delaware now. Elaine Bosler. How many of you like Elaine Bosler? Remember I said make or break a career? Well, Elaine Bosler, a guy I know, Brian Bradley, who's a comic, says she's the nicest person in the world. Give you the shirt off her back. She begins doing stand-up comedy in the early 1970s while working as a waitress at the Improv Comedy Club in New York City. Her jokes were about her experiences as a single heterosexual woman and as a comedian and the impossible expectations of both. One such joke, the sexual double standard. Men want you to scream you're the best while swearing you've never done this before. Well, she gets on the Tonight Show. It takes her about 7 years. She gets on the Tonight Show. Johnny's not there. Helen Reddy, the singer, the Australian singer, is guest hosting. She's good enough that yeah, when Johnny's there, let's have her there. And but they tell her, the producers say, yeah, we want self-depreciation material. She says no. She does her own material. Carson was furious. He tells his comedy booker, I don't ever want to see that waitress on my show again. Nearly sunk her career. Nearly sunk her career. 1985, she filmed Elaine Bosler, Party of One, but she gives it to Showtime. They look at it and say, eh. But there's new management in 1986 at Showtime. According to Bosler, one executive's wife pressured him to buy it. This is success. She went on to do 3 more specials over the next 5 years. She made it. Roseanne Barr, she's at the couch, right? She's at the couch. 1985, she makes her first appearance on the Tonight Show. She was an unknown comic. She talked about being a domestic goddess, her preferred term over being a housewife. Her weight, I'm fat, I just thought I'd point it out, and her impression of Barbra Streisand. Carson's wowed by it. There are also 2 other people wowed by it. Marcy Carsey and Tom Werner, who's now part owner of the Boston Red Sox. They were TV producers in the 1980s, and they're thinking about doing a comedy series about a working mother, lower middle class family. They see Roseanne Barr on the Carson show and say, she's it. She brought the character to life, the Roseanne show. Ellen DeGeneres, she's at the couch. November 28th, 1986, she performs on the show, and Johnny and the rest of the crowd think she's hilarious. She's called to the couch. Somebody's watching. Producers at ABC. And they decide, we're going to hire Elaine DeGeneres. We're going to put her into this role as Ellen Morgan. And that the series was called These Friends of Mine. She became the breakout star of the show, which was named Ellen. But 1997, What Goes Up Must Come Down, she revealed she was gay. Show's gone. Gone. Real quick. Takes her 5 years to get back on TV with the daytime talk show. Carroll Burnett. Carroll Burnett was on the Gary Moore Show in 1956, the CBS morning show. And in 1959, she's added to the Gary Moore Show cast, but she's also in a play that year called Once Upon a Mattress. She receives a Tony nomination. But more importantly, there's somebody in the audience who comes to watch her and is impressed with her performance. Lucy. By the way, anybody watch Jeopardy here? Sure. Merv Griffin in 1983 is having lunch with Lucy. And he says, I'm bringing back Jeopardy. Art Fleming doesn't want to do it, and I'm at an absolute loss as to who should be the host of the show. I can't figure out who would make a good host of the show. Lucy turns to him and says, Alex Trebek. Lucy also discovered Rod Serling. Lucy also put Star Trek on the air. Lucy also helped put The Untouchables on the air, and Maddox, and Mission Impossible. Through Desi Lou, and after Desi left. Lucy knew talent. She knew talent inside out. She bounced around from 1927 to 1948. She knew all kinds of talent. She was a great talent agent. After a chance meeting one night in 1959, Carroll Burnett found a lifelong friend, Lucille Ball. She came to see Once Upon the Mattress. After the show, she went backstage. 2 chatted in Burnett's dressing room for 30 minutes. She called me kid because she was 22 years older than I. Just as she was leaving, she said, kid, if you never need me for anything, just give me a call. Well, how many people tell you that? Yeah, right. Well, she's on the Gary Moore Show. And TBS thinks she's great. And we want to do a 1-hour special, but we don't think you're a good enough, big enough name to stand alone. So we're going to do the show if you find a big name guest. Her husband, Joe Hamilton, was the producer of the show. She said, call her. No, I'm not calling. Call her. Just call her. What is she going to do? Worst she could do is say no, right? She calls Lucille Ball. She said, I'll be there. When do you want me there? That was it. Show was a success. CBS offered Carol Burnett the show. Carol Burnett is one of the first women ever to host the network variety show. There was Ed Sullivan and Gary Moore and Jack Benny and Perry Como and Dinah Shore and Pat Boone and Dinah Shore. It's a man's world, isn't it? They told their variety shows really was a man's game, not for her. Well, the Putz, Tom Conway and Carol Burnett. I have a friend, Dennis, who worked on the show. He said Harvey Korman was a Putz. Shelley Saltman. Yeah, I know you're listening, Shelley. Whatever time zone you're in, 15 years we'll call. Put down the burner phone. Shelley Saltman brought Tom Conway to Los Angeles. He was in Cleveland working at a local TV station, and he registered the name Tom Conway with SAG, Screen Actors Guild, except there was a Tom Conway, so he changed his name to Tim. It was a variety show, sketch comedy program, and it was a comedy troupe, and it was on for 11 years. And they did parodies like Went with the Wind and From Here to Maternity. It was a slapstick comedy and had musical numbers. And if you watch the show on syndication now, they take out the musical numbers because they don't want to pay royalties to the performers or royalties to the writers of the song. Hilda Radner, Baba Wawa. Hilda Radner got her start in the early 1970s, the launch of the Toronto chapter of the Second City Comedy Troupe. She was there with John Candy, Dan Aykroyd, Eugene Levy, Joe O'Flaherty, Roseanne Radcliffe, and Kathleen O'Hara. But she's on Saturday Night Live, the first year of the show, and she plays Emily Latilla, never mind, Roseanne Adana, and the punk rocker Candy Slice. But she is most known for this character, Baba Wawa. Shelley, I'm talking about you again. My friend Shelley Saltman, who passed away 3 years ago, went to high school with Barbara Walters, also Barry Morse, and also Leonard Nimoy, whose father, Max, cut all of the kids' hair in the Boston area. And David Suskind's mother and Leonard Bernstein's mother used to play Mahjong with Shelley's mother. So Lenny was at the house. Lenny, why are you going into this? You're so talented. You could be a doctor or a lawyer. You're not going to get anywhere with this music. Anyway, so Baba Wawa became her unofficial unwanted nickname in the 1970s. She hated the impression. I don't talk that way, and I do pronounce my R's. If Shelley was here right now, he would say she had that lisp in high school. The Baba Wawa became a classic reoccurring character on Saturday Night Live, and my buddies at ABC said she had a lisp. We're almost done here. We're going to talk about the party record. When I was 7 years old, my uncle used to stash the party records in my house, and I came across it, put it on the old hi-fi, and still remember some of the stuff on there, which I won't repeat now. Patsy Abbott, Goldie Schwartz, the 5 dirtiest women, all of whom were Jewish, in comedy at one time. Patsy Abbott recorded 2 albums, Suck Up, You're Behind, and Have I Had You Before? She was brassy, she was sexual. She pushed back on the culture, which insisted women's roles were mothers and housekeepers. Yiddish songs, she sang about domestic matters, and the point was scatological, sexual, or just a Yiddish English curse. That was Goldie Schwartz. Bill Barth, the customer comes first. I could blow the whole network with one word. Annabelle Salesman, a body comedian, inspired Bette Midler, narrowly avoided trouble with the law by delivering her most wicked punchlines in Yiddish. She was legit at one point. The vaudeville circuit in the 30s and 40s did impressions of the woman I started with, Sophie Tucker, Al Jolson, Gypsy Rose Lee, but in the 1950s, she decided, I'm going to do raunch stand-up comedy. It was very successful doing that, and also the party record. She recorded, If I Embarrass You, Tell Your Friends. She performed in New York, Miami, Los Angeles, occasionally Too Drunk to Tone It Down, like in Miami Beach, 1952. And those people who went to see Belle Barth didn't care about obscenity, didn't care at all who saw her there, but she was arrested for obscenity. And the Yiddish punchlines, simple. The guys who were going to bust her didn't know any Yiddish. Oh, Ruth Wallace, her greatest hits, boobs. Boobs, just plain old boobs. She could have been on the Match Game. Her name, Ruth Shirley Wall, and she too was legit. Isham Jones and Benny Goodman. She was singing cabaret and jazz standards for their road tours, but she decided to go into risque material. She arrived in Australia for a tour, brought records with her. The customs agent seized the records, thinking they could ruin her career, or at least in Australia, but she got sellout crowds because of that. My old Facebook friend, the late Rusty Warren, Eileen Goldman. Her comedy was considered so risque that she was banned from TV and radio in the 1960s. She put out an album in the 1960s called Knockers Up. Knockers Up. It was a march like Diddy, the pre-National Organization of Women movement, the affirmation of female pride. Oh, she wasn't on radio and TV, but for 3 years, the record was on the Billboard chart, and she sold more than 4 million copies without exposure. Oh, this woman had a classical background. She studied piano at the New England Conservatory of Music, graduating in 1954. Her first free summer, she was entertaining in small lounges, taught there after obtaining her degree, and her mentor was Arthur Fiedler, the conductor of the Boston Pops. Pearl Williams, she's doing what comes naturally. I don't think that's the Irving Berlin song. Pearl Wolf, 1952, a heckler was telling her to get off the stage, your jokes are horrible, and she said, I'll go off. The audience howled. She became a hit. She released 9 best-selling party records. But they were not welcome in the Borscht Belt or the Catskills. The men who worked the resorts, Buddy Hackett or Tubby Boots, were just as filthy-minded as Barth, Williams, and Abbott, but they were never welcome. After all, it's a man's world. They played Miami Beach. Patsy Abbott had a place in Miami Beach, New York, Toronto, the late night slot when the crowds were drunker and rowdier. If you go into a comedy club late night, you're going to probably be drunker or rowdier. Patsy Abbott had Patsy's Place in Miami. Barth and Williams played smaller rooms at places like the Fountain Blue or the New York nightclubs that were a string below the Latin Quarter. Barbara Walters, the reason she was in Boston, her father Lou was running the Latin Quarter in Boston at the time, or El Morocco. But Barth did play Carnegie Hall. As we leave, there's a long way to go. That is Amy Schumer. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, more women were involved. Stand-up comedy was a booming business, not that the comics got paid. In fact, I tried to book Max into a place in Yonkers over by Apple, whatever it's called over there, off the Thruway. There's a comedy club. They said $60 for the night. I said, that means I get $9 and he gets 51 cents, $51. Well, you know what? He doesn't have to come here. There are plenty of comics, although Max did play Empire City. Which he got paid rather well, and I did that as a favor for him to get him there. So there are stand-up classes where failed comedians will teach you how to be a comic so you could fail and not get paid. Comedy clubs paid very little money to performers unless they were the big names. Estimated there are 10,000 amateur comedians in New York City alone. Why? Because they don't get paid. Diversity has grown. There are more women there who help fill out a show. The audience is more diverse, but it's a hard life for both men and women. Comedy Central's 100 greatest stand-ups of all time has 10 women. Roseanne Barr, number 9. Elaine DeGeneres, 16. Phyllis Diller, she's at 35. Joan Rivers, 44. Wanda Sykes, 70. Elaine Bosler at 73. Brett Butler, 87. Polar Poundstone, 88. Sandra Bernhardt, 97. Janine Garofalo, who could have been related to me if Ben Stiller married her, is at 99. Contemporary women comics, there's Wanda Sykes, Ellen DeGeneres. Joan Rivers, top 50 Rolling Stone comics of all time. Joan Rivers, number 6. Sarah Silverman, 31. Janine Garofalo, 33. Roseanne is 38. Moms Mabley, an old timer, 39. Phyllis Diller, 42. Amy Schumer, 43. The Waitress is 47, Elaine Bosler. Margaret Chow, 48. and Wanda Sykes at 50. And we leave with my buddy Max. That was down in Princeton, New Jersey, when he was doing a set down in Princeton, New Jersey prior to COVID-19. And there's me and Max together, and I got to thank Max for helping me out. He gave me Mom's Mabley and Elaine May and said the other ones were good, and we left out people like Ann Mirror, even though she's part of the family. Anyway, thank you so much. Any questions or comments, both from Zoom